Hi, and welcome to the Kent Free Library's monthly Mocktails and Masterpieces. My name is Emily, and today we are going to be learning how to paint this beautiful mountain landscape with a twist. We are just going to be using our fingers. I know that can sound a little bit intimidating, but I promise it's going to be easy and fun. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to need to do is gather your supplies and set up your workspace. If you got a kit from the library, a little brown paper bag, it should have come with a number of things that you're going to need for today's painting lesson. The first is your canvas. We've got a nice 8x10 canvas. If you're using a bigger or a smaller canvas, don't worry. You can still paint along with us. Just make sure you orient it upright and adapt your landscape to fit your space needs. We have 6 colors of paint that we'll be using today. We have 2 colors of blue, a teal sort of green, colder blue, and then a warmer ultramarine, darker blue. We also will be using white, yellow, a nice magenta color, and a Kelly green. So if you didn't get one of the painting kits from the library, just try to find some colors that are close in value and hue to the ones we'll be using today. If you are not wanting to use your fingers, that's absolutely okay. We have also included 2 brushes in every kit. We've got a large brush and a small brush. And if you're looking for more of that finger-painted look without getting your fingers dirty, we also have included a number of Q-tips. These are going to be great for mimicking the same shape and textures as a finger without dirtying your hands. So if that's more your speed, feel free to follow along using these Q-tips. Besides the things that you're going to find in your kit, you're also going to want to grab some kind of palette that you can mix your paints on. I'm going to be using this paper plate. You're also going to want to have some place to wash your hands. So I've got a little bowl full of water here. If you have a bucket, that's probably even better. The more room you have to kind of lather up your fingers and make sure you get all the paint off, the better. And you're also going to want to put down some newspapers. I've got a tarp here just because finger painting can get a little bit messy. And finally, paper towels or rags to clean off your hands in between colors or your brushes. So that's what we're going to need to start today. So to get started, I have gone ahead and I have put some of my paint onto my palette, just opened up those paints and poured them out. And now we're ready to begin painting. So I like to start with the sky. In my paintings, I like to start at the top of the canvas and work my way down. So for this sky, I envision it with the sun kind of off to this right side of the canvas. So I'm going to put the darkest part of the sky up here in the top left, starting with that ultramarine. And I like to be, when I'm finger painting, very generous with my paints. I like to do sort of a wet and wet technique, get some really cool textures. So I want to make sure that my canvas and the paint on it is staying wet for a long time. I also want it to be able to move and flow really freely. So I'm being generous with this paint. And as I move down into the right, I'm going to be working in more of those teal colors and just blending right on the canvas as I go. Being real free with my movements, I'm sort of using the whole pad of my finger here and going for a real swooping effect to give the sky a little bit of that almost impressionistic texture that you might see in, I don't know, works from Van Gogh and such. We want to give it some interest, blending those colors together as we go. So you'll notice that the acrylic paint we're using, it's really vibrant. It's very saturated, almost candy colored. And depending on what you're going for, that can be really great. But we're painting a landscape today, so we're going for maybe a little bit more natural look. So what I want to do with these colors as I'm working in the blues, I want to do something called toning them. That means introducing more gray shades. And we can do this, one way we can do this is by introducing a complementary color. So across the color wheel from blue is orange. Now you'll notice we don't have any orange on our palette, but we do have some magenta and some yellow. So by adding those 2 colors into our blue sky, we can kind of tone back that intensity and give it more of a natural look. So I'm going to go ahead and in the darkest area, I'm going to add a little bit of magenta. And this is going to make it darker, a little bit more purple. but it's also going to cut through, when I go in with the yellow, a little bit of that blue and make it a little bit closer to gray, a little bit less saturated, which is what I'm going for. And just blending that darker color now into my teal portion of the sky. And then you'll remember I'm planning on putting the sun over in this left corner. So I'm actually going to work in a little bit of white now and make this the lightest part of the sky. So we're going to go in with some teal. Again, being real generous with the paint. I know that we don't really have to worry about conserving this teal color too much because the sky is going to be the part of the painting with the most blue in it, so we won't need too much teal later on. The white, however, you do want to be careful to conserve that because, especially if you're working from a kit, if you have a whole bottle of white at home, go ahead, go crazy. I just want to let you know we will be using white a lot in this painting, so we want to make sure we have plenty left over for the clouds and for the flowers later on. Yeah, and I'm liking that. I think I'm going to add a little bit of yellow here, and then maybe a little bit of magenta. Just to, once again, you can see as I blend it, it's turning a little bit gray and kind of cutting through that real vibrant, almost unnatural looking teal, just to make it a little bit more subtle. We don't want to make it muddy, but we do want to make it a little bit less loud, I guess is a good word for it. And that's looking pretty nice. I like that. So you'll notice I didn't work the sky all the way down because we will be coming in with mountains later on, and because this is a wet on wet, we don't want to be fighting that blue paint when we're trying to put down the green. So just as far down as you think you need to in order to cover the space between the mountains. That's probably a good stopping point for me. Maybe I'll go a little bit lower in between the two. Yeah. And that's looking pretty nice. I'm happy with this sky, so we're going to keep moving forward. All right, the next step is to put in our clouds. So I'm going to go ahead and get the blue off my fingers because we're going to be moving into primarily white and yellow colors next. For the sky, if you were following along with the brush, we're covering a lot of area there, so I would definitely recommend using a larger brush. But for these clouds, if you do have a smaller brush, probably for this more detailed work and finer details, you're going to want to use the small brush. So with my pinky finger, into this still wet sky, I'm going to take some white and just go in with some dabbing motions, placing my clouds into the sky. So for me, I'm envisioning the clouds covering the whole sky from left to right, starting out small and probably getting a little bit bigger as we go. But you can have your clouds be whatever size and shape you want. You can be real creative with this. And you see I'm making a dabbing motion. And because that sky is still wet, we're getting this nice translucent effect. We're bringing this teal color into the sky. And it's all blending together nicely, making some real wispy looking clouds. And if we want these to be a little bit more visible later on, we can go back in with more white, more paint, and kind of make them more opaque. Not darker, since we're using the color white, but more opaque. Yeah, and this is looking good. So I've got the base laid down. I think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to go in maybe with some swirling motions and just kind of give my clouds a little bit more substance in some places. Just with my pinky finger, creating these nice, again, very impressionistic sort of swirls. And you don't want to overwork this too much because we are doing wet and wet, so we are trying to lay this new paint on top of the old wet paint. If we keep working it too much, we're going to start blending the colors instead of layering them. If that happens, if you find that you're just sort of creating this sky blue color and the white isn't really standing out anymore, you can just take a paper towel or a rag, wipe it back down to the canvas and kind of build up again, start over. That's kind of a a tip. We don't have erasers in painting, but we have other tricks and tools we can use to undo some things. So that's looking nice. I think maybe a little bit higher. And then last thing I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna take the tiniest bit of yellow just for a little bit of contrast. And I'm gonna dab that in just along the bottom edge of this sky. Sorry, these clouds. That was a lot of yellow. So if you find you're laying down too much paint, again, we can just kind of wipe that off and then go back in there with some white. Yeah, I like that better. Very nice. Okay, and I'm happy with those clouds, so I'm gonna keep moving. So now that we have our clouds in, we still have some white in the sky, some wet paint left in our sky. I'm gonna go ahead before we go any further and add in that sun I was talking about with just the tiniest dab of white on the tip of my pinky finger. So if you're using a brush, just use the smallest brush you have. We are gonna make a real tiny dot right at the top of the sky. And I know you might be thinking, oh, that's awful small, but if you ever look at a photograph or even go out, don't look at the sun, but take a picture of the sun, you'll see the aurora of the sun is often much bigger than the actual celestial body itself, especially in relation to the rest of the landscape. So we want a real tiny sun, because we're going for like a realism look here. And then around that sun, using just the remainder of the paint that's still on my finger, we can create this little halo effect. Now mine isn't blending too well. I think I used not as much paint as I did in our demo piece. So this has already dried the sky has already dried a considerable amount. And that's okay. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna go back in there with some wet teal color so that I have some medium on the canvas that I can blend this halo into. So if you're having the same trouble as me, this is a good solution. Otherwise, maybe that worked for you on the first try. There we go. You can see now I've got much nicer streaks going for me. And I like to do these so that they're most intense closest to the sun and then getting lighter as we work our way out. Oh. There we go. Just using the tiniest bit of white to create that halo. Yeah, that looks pretty nice. All right, moving right along. We are finished with the sky, so we're gonna move on to the mountains. Now if we look at our initial piece, you can see that we have two mountains here. We've got one further in the back and then one closer to the foreground. And you can see that the one in the back is darker and it has more blue shades in it because we find in nature, the further away something is from us, the more haze there sort of is in the atmosphere between us and what we're observing. So it does get this kind of bluish tint to it. So I'm gonna start by putting in this first mountain, the one that's farther away. And I'm gonna use green and I'm going to use that ultramarine dark blue that's on our palette to put that in. Now again, you can see that our colors are very saturated. They're very bright and intense. So I'm gonna go right in with this blue and try to cut back some of that green. But once again, we can tone this color. We can introduce some gray shades and cut down on the saturation by introducing its complementary color. So if we think about our color wheel again, across from green is going to be red. And the closest thing we have on our palette to red is magenta. So I'm going to take my index finger and I am going to go in with a good amount of magenta. And you can see at first it looks a little bit scary, but as we blend it in, we can see it does sort of absorb into this more, I would say more natural, more bluish green looking color. It's a good color for a mountainscape, I would say. So I want this mountain to be very dark and very blue at the top, which you can imagine would be like the tallest part of the mountain, the piece that's furthest away from us. And then as we move closer, as the mountain gets closer to us, the observer, we can introduce more vibrant, more warm green tones. So I'm going to go right in with that Kelly green for this bottom piece of the mountain and just sort of blend that in as we go. Okay, so what we have now is a very nice wash. We've got a very nice kind of flat looking green hill. I want to go in and I want to add a little bit more texture to give it some life, to give it some detail. So once again, going in with blue, and I can even mix this on the canvas, or sorry, on my palette before I go in. I'm going to mix up a little blue-green color, taking my finger, and I'm just going to start dabbing. I'm mixing in a little bit more magenta. And you can see with these different strokes, as I'm using these paints that haven't quite mixed together yet on my finger, they're creating these pockets of contrast right on our canvas and giving the eye something to hold on to, sort of indicating and suggesting detail in this mountainscape that's quite far away from us. So I'm really liking the little bits of pink. If you're not such a fan, stick to the blue and the green. That's totally fine. For me, though, I think it gives it some nice contrast and some interest that we were maybe lacking before. So I'm real happy with that. I'm going to move on to our second mountain. Now this one's closer to us, so it's going to be more of a bright, warmer green. There's going to be more yellow tones in the mountain, in the grass on the mountain, I should say. So once again, same index finger. We're going in right over top of these clouds. And I'm going to be mixing in a little bit of yellow as I go, because I do want these two mountains to look visually distinct. We're not using any kind of outlines to distinguish them. We're not creating a boundary between them. So the only way we can really distinguish between these mountains visually, besides texture, is color. So I do want to make sure that this mountain is a blue-green and much darker than this new mountain I'm painting in here. And that way when we look at the painting, it will be very obvious that we're looking at two overlapping hills rather than just one big homogeneous landscape. So we've got some blue, we got some yellow and some green. And once again, I'm gonna use a little bit of that magenta to kind of cut back this very almost limey color and bring it closer into hue with something we'd find in nature, or at least in this part of nature. There's certainly things in nature that are that very bright lime green, but probably not a mountain covered in grass. And you can see I've got a lot of paint on my finger. I've got a lot of paint on the canvas, which gives me a lot of medium to kind of create that texture as I go. We're being real generous with these tapping and swirling motions, creating grassy textures for ourselves. Now, if you have a flat canvas, you don't have to worry about this. But if you are using a stretched canvas the way I am with the edges, you do want to be picking it up as we go and remembering to hit these white edges. You don't want any of these white edges left when you're finished. I'm not going to move it around too much just so that I just want you to be able to see everything as I go. So do as I say, not as I do in this case. But if you got one of our kits, you probably have a flat canvas and you don't need to worry about the edges too much. All right, so now we're getting into that part I was talking about earlier where we're overlapping the two mountains and we want to make sure that they look distinct. So I'm going to go in with a lot of green and a lot of yellow to really distinguish color-wise which mountain is which. And that is looking pretty good. I am happy with that mountain. So I think we can move on. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add tiny flowers into the background of our closest mountain. I like to imagine the mountain furthest away from us is a little bit too far for us to catch those fine details, but this one closer to us, we can just kind of see the tiniest clusters of flowers on the mountain. So taking the smallest amount of paint with my pinky finger, I'm going to start with the fuchsia color and dab in tiny mountain flowers. If anyone's wondering, the reference images I used for our flower clusters today are lupins, which are, a mountain flower that you can find in many places. Here in North America and also in Scandinavia, you can find them growing in gardens and in mountainous landscapes. So as we add these flowers, I want the tiniest flowers to be the ones furthest away from us, again at the top of that mountain, so at the top edge here. And then these flowers will become larger as we work our way down the mountain and get closer to us, the viewer. So right now I am just creating flowers by touching places on the canvas where I've already placed paint, this pink paint, and just kind of taking from these paint spots and moving it around. And this does two things. One, I think it gives me a more natural shape the second time I kind of stamp. But the other thing it's doing is it's sort of softening and softening the edges of these first flowers we laid down. And it's also blending just a little bit so these fuchsia spots are a little bit less intense and abrasive. So I'm going to create a new color on my palette by mixing that ultramarine dark blue with the fuchsia color. And we're going to create a real nice sort of purple. And then using, again, my pinky, I'm going to take a good amount of this new purple color, and I'm going to come back in the canvas and add some new purple flowers to our mountainscape. And again, these are going to be biggest down further on the mountain, and the ones up top are going to be tinier. If you're using a paintbrush, definitely use the smallest paintbrush you have to be adding these tiny flowers. And that's looking pretty good. I'm gonna add maybe a couple more. Still just using the paint that I have on the canvas. I'm not even dipping into my palette too often. And that looks really nice to me. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on the foreground, the elements that are closest to us, and those would be our, I just noticed, I'm getting so involved with this mountain. We have some white patches here. So I'm going to go in and just fill in a little bit of that sky. There we go. Here we go. So I didn't take the sky far enough down earlier. So learn from my mistakes. I don't know about you guys, but this is one reason why I always like to watch a tutorial all the way through before I pick up my paintbrush, because I like to see by the end of it what things the artist wishes they could have changed, and then I can, learn from them and whatever mistakes they've made. All right, that doesn't look so bad. All right, now we're gonna put in the stems. So again, using my pinky or your smallest brush, I'm gonna mix right on my canvas a little bit of a lighter green. So remember, if we are sort of making our greens warmer and lighter the closer they are to us, this is probably the closest to sap green we're going to get in this painting. So we're gonna add a lot of yellow to this green to create a real nice sap color. And then I'm going to start from the bottom left corner of this canvas and pulling up, I'm going to create 3 stems for our lupin flowers. So we've got one right in the middle here. You can see I ran out of paint about halfway through, so don't be afraid to get a lot of paint on your fingers as you're doing this. All right, there's one. And then two, I think, will come sort of this way. Right over top of these clouds here. And reaching up into the sky. And then our last one, I think I'm going to have it sweep across these other two. So if we come right through here. Oh, that's nice. And straight down. You don't have to be too fussy with this because we are going to come in with petals and cover up a lot of these green stems that we just created. These are more guidelines for us. As we start to paint, we're going to probably have to redefine these stems later on in the process. And I am just taking my nail right now and scraping down this last one. It's a little bit thick on top, I think. But yeah, those are good placeholders for us to start building our flowers around. So my hand's got a lot of green and blue on it. I'm gonna go ahead and wash it off because we are about to go into our magenta colors as we start laying in these new petals. All right. So on these flowers, I'm envisioning 3 slightly different colored flowers. And to do that, we're gonna be mixing different colors. So this is where the palette really starts to work for us and help. So again, we've got that fuchsia color, which is gonna be the base, I think, of my center flower. The one on the left, I'm thinking is gonna be more of a purple, so I'm gonna be mixing blue and fuchsia to get that color. And then over here, I think we're gonna go with a peach, so we're gonna mix that fuchsia with yellow. So just starting with the first central flower, I am gonna take that blue and that fuchsia because I want the petals at the bottom of this flower to be larger and a little bit darker than the ones at the top. That's what I noticed when I was looking at reference photos of these flowers. So taking the side of my pinky, or actually, I think for the bottom flowers, we could even use our index finger. So go in with a medium or a larger brush maybe. I'm gonna use the shape of my finger to my advantage and use a little stamping motion to create these nice oblong petals. And again, this stem right now is just serving as a guideline. Don't be afraid to cover it up with petals. We're creating a nice cluster of petals down here at the base. And then this is like a cone-shaped flower, so as we move up, it's going to become more and more narrow, with the petals becoming smaller and centralized closer to the stem. So yeah, that's a nice color. As we work up, they're also going to become lighter. So we're going to move away from the blue hue we were using to darken it up. And right now I'm going straight in with fuchsia. And then up towards the top, to create a lighter color petal, I am going to be mixing in a little bit of white with my pink color, my fuchsia. So I'm mixing that on the canvas, and then I'm coming in now with my pinky, because we're creating a smaller petal, and just dabbing right to the top of that stem and all the way up. Very nice. Okay, so my first flower is looking pretty good. We're gonna move on. I think I'm gonna do this dark purple one next. So when you're deciding what order to do your flowers in, you definitely wanna start with the flower that you imagine being furthest away, because as we build up, these flowers are going to overlap, and so whatever flower you paint last is going to be on top of all the other flowers and therefore closest to the camera, or to you, the observer. So now we're going to create that dark purple color we were talking about by mixing a good amount of that ultramarine dark blue with our fuchsia. And again, like we did with the mountains, we're really trying to create different hues on our canvas in order to distinguish one plant from the other, one mountain from the other. So by creating a purple flower, especially because these will be very close and even overlapping on the canvas, it helps our eyes distinguish the two flowers as separate. So I'm using an index finger for these larger flowers these larger petals on the bottom. And then as I work my way up, we're going to be getting lighter. So instead of adding more fuchsia, I'm going to be adding some white. And I'm going to be transitioning to my pinky finger to create these smaller petals. And I'm noticing that I'm getting a very uniform color, which honestly, for me, I'm not a huge fan of that. I'd like to see a little bit of variation on the petals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my color isn't so blended on my palette, and that way I can get little peaks of fuchsia, well, not that much, but little peaks of fuchsia and blue in each individual petal, which just gives it a little bit more visual interest, I think. So yeah, working in more and more white into these smaller and smaller petals as we move upwards on our flower, right to the very top. It looks pretty nice. Again, I'm using a nail or a clean finger to kind of come in and remove any splotches of paint I'm not too fond of. That was a little bit too much fuchsia for me, so I went in and just tapped that out. I think we could use a little bit more white up here at the top. So let's go in and lighten this up a bit. That's pretty nice. Now you don't want to overwork this too much. You notice the more we tap, the more color we put on the canvas, but the less distinct each of these shapes become. We do want to make sure that we are getting that stamping effect and keeping those individual petals visible. So don't overwork this too much is all I'm saying. All right. And now we're going to come in with our very last flower, the one closest to us, which kind of swoops back over these other two. And like I said, this is going to be a little bit of a peach color. So I am going to mix that fuchsia into some yellow. Not too much. We aren't looking for an orange, just maybe a slightly more yellow, warmer pink than what we had before. And taking a clean index finger, I'm going to pick up that pink color. And I'm going to start laying it on the canvas. That's very nice. It's maybe a little dark for what I was going for. I might start working a little bit of white into the bottom of this color earlier than I would have on the other two flowers, just to kind of match the hue I had in my head when I started. Or I guess the shade I had in my head. That's nice. So I am layering, if this flower has this shape, I'm going ahead and layering these peach petals over the fuchsia petals we put down earlier. Okay, and then as we get further up, we're going to be using our pinky finger to create slightly smaller petals, and we're also going to be coming in with that white to make slightly lighter colored petals. I'm being real careful, again, because I want to create these very distinct looking petals, so less muddy, more visually distinguishable from one another, especially as we overlap on top of the last flower. All right, I like the petals. I know these are a little bit hard to see as individual flowers, but we're going to fix that by redelineating some of these stems in our very next step. So what we're going to do next, in order to kind of redistinguish the stems and the stamens of these flowers, we're going to take either our fingernail, or if you're using a paintbrush, then the back end of your paintbrush, and we are going to go ahead and scratch in the stems of these flowers. So once we got our main stems kind of scratched back in, we can go in and scratch out the little connecting pieces in between these clusters of flowers. And same as before, if we imagine these flowers as overlapping, we want to start scratching the flowers that are furthest away from us and finish with the flowers that are closest, so that wherever there's any overlap, the flower that is nearest to us has the final say. And once we've created a space for these stems, we could even go back in and add a little bit more green to some of these areas. And when I say green, I mean that sap green that we were using earlier. I want to use my tiniest finger or your tiniest brush to do this. But you can go in and lay that back down if you would like. Just bringing a little bit more green to these hues where they've vanished. All right. And again, this technique works only when you're doing a wet and wet painting. So you want to make sure you laid down enough paint on your canvas to start with so that it hasn't dried by the time you get to this step. Because you can see right at the top of my very first flower, it has dried a little bit, so we weren't able to scratch into it the way we would have otherwise. All right. And the last thing we can do to finish off this painting, it's something that I liked in the original that we did earlier. You can see there's a lot of different flecks, and I almost like to imagine pieces of pollen flying around this painting. So if you'd like to achieve this look, totally optional. If you want the clean, finished sort of version of this canvas, you can stop here. I'm going to take a brush. So we are moving away from the finger painting for this last step. I've got a big, almost paintbrush. You could also use a toothbrush, would be really great for this. Or just the biggest brush that you have in your kit. And we are going to dab on just a little bit of white and a little bit of yellow. Those are the two colors I used. You could really use any colors you're feeling, but I am kind of imagining these as bits of pollen that are floating around in the spring breeze. And then with our brush loaded up with paint, we are going to gently flick it onto the canvas, being mindful of the direction that we are holding the brush, because that's going to influence where the paint ends up and what sort of lines it's forming on the canvas. So we got a lot of yellow in that pass. I think I'm going to go in with a little bit more white. And this is a messy step, so make sure you do this in an area where you don't mind cleaning up little bits of paint later. And if you have a little bit too much, like I think here this might be distracting a bit from the flower, we can go in either with a clean fingernail or with a little bit of paper towel and just sort of dab that away or dab it into the canvas. I'm using a nail here just to scratch out a little bit of that intensity. If it's still wet, you could even just tap it out to blend it. Mine has dried a little bit, so that's not an option for me anymore, but yeah, looks pretty good. This is our finished product. I hope you guys had a lot of fun today painting with your fingers. I think it's a great exercise for loosening up and just remembering what brought you to painting in the first place, why it gives you joy. I had a lot of fun. We are going to be back here, same place, same time, in 2 months for a new painting. I hope to see you all then.